As you stare out at your future, so much is unknown except the fact that so much is unknown. There will be change. The Stoics are not emotionless, but they do try to be less emotional, particularly in the big moments, in the moments that matter.
Please join me in welcoming Brian Holiday to the stage.
So I was here exactly a year ago talking to the class of 26. And two things stand out at me from that talk. Number one, right as I was about to go on, they said, don't let all the coughing bother you. And I said, what? And they said, the midshipmen are in the process of giving each other every respiratory illness known to man. And I assume that's still true tonight, you guys being so new here, so if you need to cough, don't worry about it. But the second thing that strikes me how much has changed even in the 1 year that's transpired, right? It feels like change, which we know is a constant, which we know is ever present, is speeding up, right? And if you guys think about the amount of change that you're going to see in the 4 years that you're here, however long your career in the Navy is, right? You're going to see radical change, radical disruption, all sorts of things are going to happen to you, as have always happened, right? You're going to see boom markets and bull markets, you're going to see recessions, you're going to see depressions, you're going to see good economies and bad economies. You may well see conflicts with foreign powers, whether we're talking about China or Russia or North Korea or Iran, right? All sorts of things are going to be happening, right? There's going to be technological disruption, right? Perhaps profound technological disruption. There could be more civil unrest, right? Things are going to happen. They have always happened and they will continue to happen. The Stoics talk about how existence is like a river, that the what and the why of life is in constant flux, that nothing is stable. Marcus Aurelius says the infinity of the past and the future gapes before us, right? As you stare out at your future, at your career, right, so much is unknown except the fact, right, that so much is unknown. There will be change. So if nothing is stable, if things are changing constantly, right, what do we turn to? What guides us? What do we lean on? The Stoics would say we turn to virtue, specifically the four cardinal virtues: courage, discipline, justice, and wisdom. I spoke here maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and they gave me a compass, right? I'm sure you have learned, or you soon will learn, that the points on the compass are also known as the cardinal points on the compass, right? North, south, east, west, courage, justice, discipline, wisdom. Cardinal comes from the Latin cardos, or hinge. The idea is that these are the pivotal things, that the door to the good life, to peace, prosperity, that this is what it hinges on. These are pivotal ideas. These are ideas you turn to, that you base your life on. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about virtue, but specifically we're going to talk about what I think is the most dependable and probably the most essential of the virtue. We're going to talk about discipline, right? You can know what to do in any situation, but if you don't have the fortitude, the strength to bring it about, if you don't have the discipline, it doesn't really matter. So we're going to talk about discipline today. The Stoics would say that for centuries, men have been fighting over little bits of territory, right? Nations have tried to become enormous empires, right? We've sought success, we've sought riches, we've sought power. And they'd point out how interesting it is, we seek these external things, but what we neglect is actually the most valuable of empires. The Stoics would say that the greatest empire is ourselves, right? The empire between our ears, right? Seneca would say that no one is fit to rule, to be a leader, who is not first master of themselves. That's what discipline is, right? We're talking about self-discipline, not the discipline you exert over others necessarily. First, we're talking about the discipline you exert over yourself, right? And let's start physically, because I think that's the easiest. It's probably the one that you guys are the most familiar with. I don't think we need to belabor it. None of you would be here without some semblance of physical discipline, right? You're in good shape, you work hard, you know how to push yourself, right? That's physical discipline, right? And that's an essential part of this virtue. Let's talk about waking up early. Maybe not as early as Jocko wakes up every morning, but let's talk about waking up early. It's the first choice that we make, and is it a choice we make out of discipline or not? One of the interesting passages in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius says, at dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being, right? He says, or is this what I was created for, to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? I remember reading this when I was your exact age in college. I'm reading Meditations in my college dorm room. I'm dreading having to go to my early morning class the next day, and this strikes me from Marcus. Here's the most powerful man in the world giving himself a pep talk about getting up early, about seizing the day. He says, yeah, it's warmer under the blankets, but he says, were you born to feel nice and warm? No. He says, doesn't matter that it's nicer here, right? You've got a job to do. He says, just like spiders and birds and ants and bees and plants, we all have a task. We all help contribute to the order of the world, and we have to run to do our job as a human being. We have to run to do what our nature demands, right? He says, people who love what they do wear themselves down doing it. They forget even to wash and eat. This is physical discipline that we're talking about. Really what discipline is, starting with this first choice that we make in the morning, it's a choice about deciding who's in charge, right? Is the body in charge or are you in charge, right? Are your urges in charge or are you in charge, right? Is the snooze button in charge or are you in charge, right? And so it's unfortunate we tend to think of philosophers as these academics, these theorists, these people who think about abstract ideas, but in fact, the Stoics were doers, right? They were physically active, they were physically strong, right? Musonius Rufus says that the philosopher's body, this is Epictetus' philosophy teacher, says the philosopher's body should be well prepared physically because the virtues make use of this instrument for the affairs of life, right? Philosophy is something you apply to your job, to your life. If you don't have strength, if you don't have discipline, you're not going to be able to do that, right? I try to do something hard physically every single day, no matter what the circumstances. That's swimming or running or biking. I try to push myself. I go in a cold plunge. There's all sorts of benefits, they say, for cold plunges, that it improves the circulation, improves your cardiovascular health, right? It boosts the immune system. And all this may be true, but I actually don't care about it at all, right? What I care about is the muscle I am building by doing something that every part of me does not want to do, right? The muscle is sliding into something that's 35 or 36 degrees and then staying in it when every part of you wants to get out, right? That's the muscle that says, I've got to do it, so I'm going to do it now. I'm not going to procrastinate. I'm not going to make excuses. I'm not going to give myself an off, right? The same cold shower. The muscle is the cranking of the knob in the direction you don't want it to go. That's building the muscle that matters. Everything else, the health benefits from running, from lifting weights, from pushing yourself physically, they're all secondary to the real muscle you're building, which is the muscle of discipline. You're the person who is in charge of themselves. Seneca says we treat the body rigorously so that it is not disobedient to the mind. And yet, as much as discipline is about pushing and pushing and pushing, it's also about self-control even of this pushing. I said that I try to do something hard every single day. Do I do it when I'm sick? Do I do it when I'm injured, making something worse, and then ultimately miss even more time, right? The tension of discipline is there also. The Stoics would say that moderation, right, or temperance, right, the midpoint between two extremes is also a form of discipline. I think sleep is a good example of this, right? All-nighters seem like discipline, right? You're working hard through the night, you're burning the midnight oil. But are you doing that because it needs to be done, or are you doing that because you procrastinated, because you didn't study, because you waited until the last minute? You could have been chipping away at it every day, but you didn't, and now you're doing this thing, you're patting yourself on the back, you're saying, I'm the kind of person that pulls an all-nighter. But that's actually the result of a lack of discipline and not evidence of discipline, right? You're also the person who's not going to be able to rise early the next day because you're exhausted, or even if you do, you're not going to be functioning at a high enough level, right? So the decision to get out of bed early, at dawn when you struggle, when you want to stay under the warm blankets, right? This is actually downstream from the decision that you made at 9 or 10 or 11 o'clock at night or 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, right? Admiral Stavridis, class of 76. In his book, Sailing True North, he talks about how sleep is an act of character, right? That's why they talk about sleep discipline, knowing that missing even just a few hours of sleep, obviously there are circumstances when one must do this, but missing just a few hours of sleep is equivalent to drinking or getting high in some cases. It affects the judgment. It makes you not as sharp, makes you make worse decisions. And so the decision to be disciplined, to carve out the time you need to compete and operate at a peak level, is an essential choice of discipline and thus a statement of character. Think about someone like Lou Gehrig, arguably the greatest baseball player of all time, has the longest streak in baseball for 50 years, 2,100 plus consecutive games. He plays through injuries, he plays through illness. He doesn't quit, he pushes himself. This is what obviously great athletes, this is what disciplined people do. But he's sort of worshipped as a god on the Yankees, one, because in contrast to Babe Ruth, who's the opposite of all these things, right? You look at a picture of Babe Ruth and you wonder how he could even do it, right? He's overweight, he's out of shape, he smokes, he eats terribly, right? He cuts his own career short. Lou Gehrig's career is tragically cut short by Lou Gehrig's disease. Babe Ruth's career is tragically cut short by the decisions he makes off the field. Babe Ruth dies at 53, right, as a result of these decisions. So why is Lou Gehrig so admired by his teammates? It's not for anything crazy. They say there's no finer man that walked the earth. He didn't drink, chew, or smoke, and he was in bed by 9:30 or 10 each night. Discipline, it seems like a lot, but it's actually simple. It's actually relatively easy choices that everyone could make, but so few actually do. One of Gehrig's biographers who actually went to school with him, he would say that Gehrig's clean living isn't smugness or prudery. It wasn't about personal sanctification. He didn't think he was better than anyone, but that he had this ambition. He wanted to be truly great at what he did. He wanted to realize the gifts that he'd given. He wanted to be the kind of athlete he knew he could be. So he wanted something, and not doing those things, being disciplined, was the most sensible and efficient way of doing that, right? It's not that we don't do them because they're sinful, that might be what you believe, but we also don't do them because they are bad for us. They hold us back, they set us back, they cut our careers, they cut our lives short. Seneca would say that everyone is a slave to something, right? Sex or money or ambition, power, hope, fear. A lot of us are slaves to our phones, to coffee, right? To cigarettes, right? We should be really suspicious of these things that have power over us. We should be asking ourselves, do I have the habit or does the habit have me, right? It's one thing to be a slave in ancient Rome, Seneca was saying. It's another thing to willingly be a slave to something, right? This is the general Marius. Seneca talks about Marius. He's one of the great ambitious Roman generals. He says Marius commands armies, but ambition commands Marius. His point was that Marius had all this power, but Marius wasn't in his own power, right? He didn't command the greatest empire. He might have led the Roman Empire for a time, but he didn't control himself. His habits did, his lusts did, his ambition did. So the question is, again, who is in charge, you or someone or something else? Muhammad Ali says that when we control our life, our physical needs, our lower self, we elevate ourselves. That's what the first part of discipline is. It's about the elevation of the self. It's about deciding who is in charge. You or your desires, your higher self, or your lower self. And then that leads us into the next area of discipline, which would be mental discipline. I talked to you a little bit about Lou Gehrig. He has this long streak. You want to talk about long streaks? Queen Elizabeth II takes power in the early 1950s, and she doesn't miss a day of work for the next 7 consecutive decades, right? You talk about the way a president ages from the day they take office and then the day they leave office 4 or 8 years later, right? This is that journey for her, right? Her entire life almost in this incredibly difficult, stressful, and unique job that demands an immense amount of physical discipline, which we should stipulate that she didn't get enough credit for. In her reign, she visits 126 countries. She travels over 1 million miles by sea, millions more by air. She personally meets and shakes hands with 4 million people, right? She gives out 100,000 awards personally. She survives multiple assassination attempts. Well into her 80s and 90s, she would spend hours on her feet, right? A grueling schedule that much younger people couldn't keep up with. But what's actually impressive about her, what's unique about this job, is that the monarch of England, the King of England, has very little actual power. They are a figurehead. They are a symbol. Their job is one of embodiment. Their job is one of not doing things, right? Not having opinions, not giving interviews, not intervening, right? Their job is to stand back. Right? This is a woman who is personally trained for her job by Winston Churchill. She is almost always the most informed person in the room. She sees every prime minister through Boris Johnson, and yet she's not allowed to tell them what to do. She can only subtly influence things, right? She has to keep her opinions to herself. She has to wait and see. Her discipline is a different kind of discipline. It's not pushing herself physically, just pushing herself physically. It's also restraining herself mentally, right? Not saying things. This might seem easy, but it's actually quite hard, right? One of her press secretaries would say that what's so brilliant about Queen Elizabeth was her quietness. She says, in a very noisy world where people constantly want to express themselves and overreact, the Queen has done the opposite. And again, this doesn't seem like much, but I'll contrast it with a more recent example. Here we have Elon Musk, the richest man in the world. This is a guy with 10 children, 3 companies, so much stuff to do, and he wakes up every day and he picks fights on Twitter. He's currently in the middle of extricating himself from a fight with Mark Zuckerberg, right? He should be busy, he should be restrained, he should be laser focused on getting us to Mars, right? Building electric cars, but he's not. And he's not because he lacks this fundamental discipline, and it causes him trouble constantly. I think the reason he's trying to get out of this fight with Mark Zuckerberg, you want to talk about physical discipline, that dude is jacked now. He's been training in jiu-jitsu for many, many years. It's quite impressive, right? But the idea is it's harder to not say things than it is to say things, right? We think that leaders are constantly expressing themselves. No, a leader realizes that actually saying less than necessary is usually the right path, that you have to absorb criticism, you have to absorb being misinterpreted, right? You have to not say, not speak. And this discipline is essential, right? But this is hard to do in a world of social media. One of my rules is I don't touch my phone for the first 30 minutes to 1 hour that I'm awake. I don't want to get sucked into precisely that nonsense. But for many of us, our phones look like noise machines, right? They're filled with alerts, they're filled with interruptions. We can't focus, we can't do what they call deep work because we're constantly pinging from task to task. We lack the mental discipline to lock in on the task in front of us, to lock into our strategic objective, to lock into what the most important thing is, and ignore the things that are not important, that are not urgent, right, that are not essential, and stay focused on what we need to stay focused on. George Washington is introduced to Stoicism as a 16-year-old. A neighbor gives him a copy of the books. And then he watches a play called Cato, which was kind of the Hamilton of its day, if you will, a popular play about Stoicism. And actually, Washington takes from this play a line in the play. Actually, many of the lines in this play you would know well. I regret I have but one life to give to my country, or give me liberty, or give me death. These are lines that the founding fathers crib from this great play about Cato. Another one is, we can't ensure success, but we can deserve it. So Washington takes from this play his motto, and his motto is that he wants to look at everything in the calm light of mild philosophy. He's talking about being able to step back, not doing things in the heat of the moment, being able to reflect, being able to think, right? This is the essence of Stoic philosophy. One of the great pivotal moments of American history, not particularly well known, is the Newburgh conspiracy, where a group of military officers discussed overthrowing the Continental Congress because they hadn't been paid. And Washington, again, looking at this in the calm light of mild philosophy, gets up, he quotes this very line to them, and he talks them down off the ledge. Great leaders are not just aggressive, they're not just taking action, they're not just decisive, but they're also reflecting, they're also pausing, they're also thinking. They're in command of themselves rather than events being in command of them. Washington, always looking in the calm light of mild philosophy. I would argue that another pivotal moment in American history, another presidential great moment, October 1962, Kennedy goes to bed, wakes up, the CIA tells him there are nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba. Now, almost all of his military advisors tell him that the only option is an invasion, is a bombing campaign. Kennedy has the fortitude, the strength, the discipline to stop them, to go, I hear what you're saying, but what is Russia going to do after that? Right? And what are we going to do after that? And what are they going to do after that? Kennedy has the discipline in this moment not to rush ahead, but to stop and to think and to reflect. You can see him in the White House, leaned over, the weight of the world literally on his shoulders. But that's the point. That's the kind of responsibility that rests on a leader, and why they can't be emotional, why they can't be reactive, why they must be still and they must be calm. Right? Kennedy's great invention here, great innovation, is the quarantine of Cuba. Actually, it's initially phrased as a blockade, a naval blockade of Cuba, and even there, Kennedy decides to call it a quarantine, which seemed less aggressive, right? He's de-escalating the situation, right? And Kennedy's discipline here is impressive, but so is the discipline of every captain on those ships, on those submarines, on the American and on the Russian side, right? The move, the decision to put missiles there was a rash, impulsive, and ultimately strategic, stupid move by the Russians. But after this, right, the reason we are here right now, the reason that the world wasn't annihilated in a nuclear holocaust was because Kennedy looked at it in the calm light of mild philosophy, and he's able to communicate this to Khrushchev. Khrushchev sends Kennedy back a famous telegram, right, that says something about the knot of war in the rope. He says, we're tugging at this rope, and it's pulling the knot tighter and tighter. And he says it's going to get so taut that eventually the only way to untangle it is to cut it with the sword of war, right? So leaders, commanders, right, people in positions of responsibility have to learn how to practice this form of mental discipline: calmness, reflection, stillness, not rushing ahead, thinking through the consequences, right? Thinking through the decision loop, running the game theory, as Kennedy famously does. You can actually see Kennedy's notes that he took during the missile crisis. You can see he's trying to calm himself down. He draws a picture of a sailboat. He's trying to get himself out of the situation he's in, right? You can see little notes he's writing to himself, right? Trying to calm himself down. Diplomacy, 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 right? He's trying to work his way out of this situation. Journaling is a very powerful way to do this. Kennedy also takes swims in the White House pool, which is now the White House briefing room. He would, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, send a note to the gardener thanking her for her work saving humanity, because he took these walks in the White House rose garden to calm himself down. But journaling is an essential practice. This is what Marcus Aurelius is doing on the battlefield. This meditations comes from Marcus Aurelius' journaling to himself, writing notes to himself, calming himself down. I practice a journaling practice every day. I want to put my thoughts out on the page instead of vomiting them on the people around me. Again, this is why Kennedy's taking the walks, right? It's why he's going for the swim. It's why he's getting out in nature. We have to get ourselves to a calmer place. People think of Stoicism as being emotionless. That's not what it is. Marcus Aurelius says we want to get to a place where we're like the rock that the waves crash over and eventually the sea falls still around. The Stoics are not emotionless, but they do try to be less emotional, particularly in the big moments, in the moments that matter. General Mattis has talked about this. He says the single biggest problem for leaders in the information age is too much information. Things are moving too quickly. He says they don't have enough space for reflection. They don't have the discipline to get to silence and solitude, right? Admiral Stavridis talks about how great decision makers have to synthesize. 76? 47! Stavridis talks about how a great decision maker has to synthesize all the data that's being thrown at you, right? You have to correlate it, you have to check it, then you have to, of course, act decisively. And he says the way to do this well is by doing the physical things that we're talking about, being well rested, clearing your mind, right? Breathing deeply, lowering your voice, not getting upset, right? Moving your field of vision, getting in motion, right? This is the process of mental discipline, right? We make good decisions by being in command of ourselves, right? By having a command center, right? The Stoics talk about the mind as being the command center, our ruling reason, our capacity for rational thought, for reflection, for getting to clarity and truth. This is the command center from which everything else descends, right? We do this by being firm and not fragile. I opened this by talking about change. I think it's worth coming back to that for a second. So Queen Elizabeth, she's born in the 1920s. She takes power in the 1950s. When Queen Elizabeth was a little girl, she met one of the last surviving veterans of the British invasion of Afghanistan, which happened in the mid-1800s. Towards the end of her life, her grandson, Prince Harry, would also fight in Afghanistan, right? You think of the span of that life, almost a century. You think about the change, you think about the things that she sees in her lifetime. This is a person whose job is all about tradition, and yet the monarchy is almost unrecognizable from when she took it over to where it is now. It had to be, right? All sorts of things became untenable, became impossible. There were economic shocks, there was wars, there was disruption, attitudes changed. And she had to embrace and adjust all of this as every single person does. She would say that change is a constant and managing it is an expanding discipline. Actually, the motto of the royal household is one that I think makes sense for the Navy. It makes sense for every person, right? So we're all born in a time and place. We get values from our parents, from our institutions. And yet, the world is reinventing itself and changing always. The motto of the royal household, it was, if things are going to stay the same, then things are going to have to change, right? This embracing of change, of disruption, is everything. The Stoics say, you don't get someone to tell you what to do, you get someone to make you adaptable to circumstances, right? This is what resilience is. It's a flexibility, right? The final law, the ultimate law in the greatest book on strategy ever written, The 48 Laws of Power, is assume formlessness, right? Every law in the 48 Laws of Power ends with a counter law, right? A reversal of the law. So things are true, and then their opposite is also true, right? These are all the things that you do, and then you have to ignore all those things and do what the moment demands, right? This is the paradoxical nature of life and of leadership and discipline, right? We have to assume formlessness. Bruce Lee says, be like water, right? Everything is always in flux. We have to be flexible, and yet there are values, there are ideals, there are principles that we always hold fast to, right? And it's from these values, courage, discipline, justice, and wisdom, that we create calm within the storm, that we grab firm hold of our mind, of our responsibilities, of our priorities, while everyone else loses theirs. And this is then the highest form of discipline, where the rubber truly meets the road. I think there's something beyond just being physically and mentally disciplined. There's what one does under pressure. There's what one does when the stakes are high, when one's life is on the line. You think about something like the civil rights movement. We've lost sight of the fact, because this cause was so undeniably just and morally correct, that we see it as a foregone conclusion that they would win. Because they deserved to win, of course, they were always going to win. But that's not how life works at all, right? What's profound and what's poorly understood about the civil rights movement is the physical, mental, and spiritual discipline that allows these men and women to remake the United States, a sort of a third founding, if you will. Thomas Ricks, a great military historian, he recently wrote a book called Waging a Good War, and he looks at the civil rights movement as a series of military campaigns, which it was. It's about taking war to the enemy. It was about beating and overwhelmingly better staffed and stronger opponent. So how do they do this, right? Well, first off, we have to dispense with the notion that the civil rights movement was spontaneous, right down to Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks trained in a school for activists. The day that she decides not to get up in that bus was spontaneous. But the fortitude, the strength, the will that goes into it was not, right? The civil rights movement wasn't emotional, or it was strategic, right? It was organized, it was focused, it was patient, it was relentless, it was disciplined, and it was superhuman in this discipline. That's a picture of Martin Luther King. I don't know if you can see this here, but right there, that's a 6-inch knife buried in his chest. It is millimeters from nicking his heart. He could have easily died. And there he is, calmly sitting there, receiving medical attention after having checked in on the status of the woman who'd attempted to kill him. There's another famous story of Martin Luther King. He's on stage like this, talking to a large group of people, and a literal neo-Nazi walks on stage and begins to pummel Martin Luther King with his fists. And it's this incredible moment because Martin Luther King is a proponent of nonviolence, and yet in a moment where someone is beating you, the audience could hear this sickening sound of flesh on flesh and fists connecting with bone. So amazing, they said, was not just that Martin Luther King doesn't fight back. They said they watched him drop his hands like a baby and absorb the blows. And eventually the two are separated. And as soon as he recovers physically, right, they take him backstage. Again, what Martin Luther King wants to know is how the person who attacked him is doing. It's an incredible conquering of the self, of every reasonable emotion that one would have. This is a result of his meditation and reflection and learning, his commitment to a set of values that precludes a set of very normal human responses. Right? This is John Lewis and one of the white freedom riders, after they have been viciously beaten, pulled off a bus and beaten by the Klan. And there they are just casually munching on an apple, right, as they're covered in their own blood. Like, these are people that they could beat, but these are also people that could not be beaten, right? You look at John Lewis's mugshot, he's arrested dozens and dozens of times, and you see this smirk, right? This is the smirk of someone who has elevated himself above the petty circumstances that he is in and become unbeatable at a profoundly disciplined level. The civil rights protesters, as they would begin rallies, they would often hold up their toothbrushes, which they'd packed with them. They held up their toothbrushes. They were saying, we're ready to go to jail. We're intending to go to jail. And again, these are people that could be beaten, but not be beat, right? They could handle the violence that was thrown on them. Their opponents could not handle the nonviolence. The nonviolence was so transcendent, so unexpected, so superhuman that it not just flummoxed the vicious police officers and governors and mayors of these towns, but it forced them into overreacting, into making precisely the kinds of emotional mistakes that we're talking about, right? Again, here's John Lewis being beaten once again. The civil rights movement was profoundly about suffering. It was about deliberate suffering, but they had the discipline to endure this suffering because they knew what was on the other side. They kept their eye on the prize, as they said. It's also because their cause was profoundly just and morally correct that they had the strength and the awareness of what their suffering was for and why it mattered, right? When your cause is right, it makes it easier to be disciplined to endure because you know what's on the other side, right? Ukraine and Russia, one can endure suffering, one is deliberately suffering in a way that the other side cannot even conceive of because one side is right and the other is not, right? The Stoics say that the whole point of philosophy, the whole point of what you're doing here is so when the rubber does meet the road, when you experience difficulty or trials or adversity, that you can say to yourself, this is what I trained for, right? this is the circumstances that I am able to adjust to, adapt to, make the most of, right? This is the USS Nevada trying to steam out of Pearl Harbor after it's been attacked in December of 1941. And I was just reading Walter Lord's fascinating book, Day of Infamy, about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he quotes Ensign Charles Berdinger, class of 41. So December of 41, he is months from graduation, right? Months out of graduation. And there his ship is attacked, and he has to give this order. He has to give this order. The deck's been wiped out, and he has to give this order for men to go from the lower decks to fill in on the guns, right? Sending them potentially to grave injury or death. And Walter Lord, sort of paraphrasing what he gets here, he says that no one murmurs a word, and his orders are instantly obeyed. And in this moment, right, this person who sat where you sat, who went to the classes that you went, he said, understands more clearly the reasons for the system of discipline, the drills, the little rituals, the exacting course at Annapolis, the gold braid, all the things that made the Navy so hard were also what made it work, right? You train in discipline, you do the hard things, you decide who's in charge, so in the moments when it really matters, you decide who's in charge. When James Stockdale is shot down over Vietnam, right, he says to himself, I am leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. His philosophy training is literally rushing back to him in this moment. He would reflect on his terrible time in that prison, in the ways that the discipline that he learned and the adversity that he underwent here at Annapolis trained him for this very moment, right? It trained him for this very moment. And it was unimaginable suffering and struggle and difficulty. And it's the works of the Stoics, it's the virtues that we're talking about, that he turns to like a compass, right? That he turns to like a compass. It's not just being shot down, it's not just being in solitary confinement, right? It's not just being tortured and deprived. But when other people are suffering, and he has a chance to stop it, right? When he's asked to go on camera and betray his country, it's in these moments that Stockdale is willing to sacrifice, again, at a transcendent level, at an almost superhuman level, beating his face in with a stool, at one point even attempting suicide to send a message. I recently interviewed Captain Dave Carey, who's class of 64. He was shot down a few months after Stockdale, and he was telling me he's sitting in his cell and he hears the tapping, the code that they tap to each other. And it's a message from CAG. It says, CAG says, remember what Epictetus said. So you can imagine Carey is thinking, what the hell did Epictetus say? Not everyone was sent to Stanford to study philosophy by the Navy. He has no idea what Stockdale is talking about, right? The teachings of the Stoics were not quite on the curriculum yet. But he comes to understand that what Stockdale is passing him is one of the most timeless ideas in all of Stoicism. Epictetus, who's a slave, who is tortured, who struggles immensely in the course of his life, would say that a podium and a prison is each a place, one high and the other low, but we have a freedom of choice inside this if we wish. We still decide what we're going to do. We still decide who we're going to be. There are still some things inside us that no external force can touch, that no one can take away from us, that only we can relinquish, right? We don't control what happens. We control how we respond to what happens. That's what Stoicism is. We always have this choice. What are we going to do? Who are we going to be? And again, these are the choices that Stockdale makes. This is where he steps up and lives as a Stoic, right? At a level that it's difficult even to fathom. The same goes for John McCain, class of 58. McCain in that same prison is given a chance to go home early, right? If his discipline lapses, he embarrasses his country, but he gets away from this terrible place. He has the courage. He has the sense of justice, the sense of right and wrong, right? He has the wisdom to understand the trap he's being walked into. And then he has the discipline. Imagine the discipline, right? You can barely use your arm. You want nothing more than to go home. You want nothing more than to simply survive. And he says no. He says no. And this is the discipline that we're talking about, right? The sacrifice that we're talking about. Epictetus was asked to summarize Stoic philosophy in 2 words. And I think it also encapsulates the experiences of Stockdale and McCain and Captain Carey. He says, persist and resist. Persist and resist. You push through some things, and there are some things that you have the strength simply not to do. This is what Stoicism is. This is the message that I want to leave you with. And as we wrap up, I want to go back to this idea of discipline, because again, we tend to think of discipline as this thing that is enforced on us, or this thing that we enforce on others. But actually, discipline comes from, the root word of discipline is about being a student, right? This is also where we get the idea of discipleship. Who are you a disciple of? Who are you a student of, right? Whose example of discipline are you following in, right? Who are you a student of? Of what? Of who? Hopefully of Stoicism, and then hopefully of some of the greats we've been talking about tonight. Marcus Aurelius being an example of this. I think what's incredible about the life of Marcus Aurelius' father is an emperor. He's chosen at an age not far from the one that all of you are at right now. An incredible amount of responsibility, an intimidating obligation. There's some speculation, some reason to suspect Marcus Aurelius breaks down in tears when he's told he will someday be emperor, because he can think of all the bad kings of history. He can think about how tempting and difficult and onerous this job is going to be. And yet he has this dream. He has this dream that his shoulders are made of ivory, that he has the strength, he has the discipline to get through it. And as it happens, Marcus Aurelius is a little bit too young to become emperor, just as many of you are too young yet to be the leaders that you someday will be. And so the Emperor Hadrian, who's setting in motion this plan, assigns Marcus a mentor, a man named Antoninus. Antoninus is named emperor in exchange for naming Marcus Aurelius his successor. And the idea is that Antoninus, who's pretty old, might live for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and Marcus will take over then. Well, Antoninus lives for more than 2 decades. And so in some ways, this is exasperating and frustrating. We all want to get in the job that we want to do it now. And Marcus has to spend 20 years studying under this. But instead of resenting it, instead of hating it, he embraces it. He endures a long apprenticeship. And it's this apprenticeship that makes him great. For 20 years, he studies under Antoninus. Even after Antoninus is gone, all he's striving to do is live up to the example that Antoninus set. In fact, the first pages of Meditations are all filled with Marcus meditating on what he learned from Antoninus, the example that he's trying to live up to. We contrast Marcus studying under Antoninus with Nero, who has a very similar journey, assigned to study under Seneca. This is an old statue that illustrates the way that Nero has contempt for the teachings. He thinks he already knows. His ego's getting in the way. He doesn't have the discipline to submit to a tried and true process that shapes a leader into what they need to be great, right? My mentorship was under a guy named Robert Greene, who I mentioned earlier, wrote the 48 Laws of Power, wrote the 33 Strategies of War, one of the great authors and thinkers of our time. For years, I worked for Robert, learning how to do what I do, learning how to think about what I need to think about, how to think, period, right? And so who do we apprentice under? Who mentors us? Who teaches us? Whose example are we striving to live up to? Washington, right, I said, is given the Stoics at 16. He strives to be like Cato all his life. His other hero is Cincinnatus, the great Roman general who's called to save Rome in its darkest moment and then resigns his commission, his dictatorship, just 16 days after saving Rome. Right? Absolute power is supposed to corrupt absolutely, but it doesn't in Cincinnatus' case, and it doesn't in Washington's case either, right? because he has this man he's a disciple of. There's a famous statue of Washington as Cincinnatus, but when Washington resigned his commission just a few blocks from here in Annapolis, right, he's modeling the example of Cincinnatus. And every president from him to FDR is modeling that same example, voluntarily only serving 2 terms, right? Discipline is contagious, right? Seneca says we have to choose ourselves a Cato, the way that Washington did. We have to have a mentor, someone who leads us, who inspires us. That's who Seneca's Cato was. It was Cato. Even in Seneca's famous death, he's forced to commit suicide by Nero, his former student, right? It comes back and gets him in the end. He's modeling his end like Cato. The civil rights movement, when people said, what are they going to do next? Where did they get all this from? The answer was they got it from Gandhi. They learned from Gandhi, right? Whose example are you following and who are you trying to make proud? These strong people make us better, right? Their example calls us to do better, to draw on a reserve of discipline, of strength, of selflessness, of sacrifice that perhaps we don't even know is there, right? When I talked to Captain Carey, that's what he was telling me. I asked him, what message would he pass along to this class? And he said, look, yes, I was tested in the Hanoi Hilton. And he said, I didn't know if I had what it took, but it turned out that he did, right? Because of the people that are around him, because of the training that he had. And he said he wants people to know that they have that same power within them also, just hasn't been called out of them yet, right? This is why we cultivate our heroes. This is why we study the philosophy. This is why we go through the training, so that in these moments of challenge and adversity, in difficulty and pain, right, we say, this is what I train for, this is what I do. Seneca says, without that ruler, we can't make crooked straight. We don't have the thing that we aspire to. So we seek out these mentors, we seek out these heroes. Some of their names are all over this campus here, right? You could put them on your home screen, on your phone. You can read their books. You can write their words out in your own hand. But we seek them out and we try to make them proud. We try to live up to their example. Jimmy Carter, class of 46. After he graduates, he wants to get into the submarine service, and he does. As the tradition continues, to join the submarine service, you have to be interviewed. And at that time, Admiral Rickover did every one of these interviews himself. Admiral Rickover is class of 22. And Rickover is sitting across from Carter, a promising student. He had all the right resumes. He was highly recommended. Rickover is sitting there, and he looks at Carter, and he says, how did you stand in your class at the Naval Academy? And Carter proudly tells him how he's top 100. And he thinks that this is what Rickover wants to hear, but it isn't. Rickover looks at him and he says, that's all well and good, but did you always do your best? And Carter has to think about it. He has to think about it, and he does, right? He was being asked, was he always as disciplined as he could have been? Did he do all that he could? Or were there lessons that he tuned out? Were there days that he sort of went through the motions? Was there extra credit he could have done? Was there more PT that he could have done? Was there books he could have read? Were there questions he could have asked? Could he have tried harder? Was he afraid of trying as hard as he could, of doing his best? And he found that the answer uncomfortably was no. He hadn't always done his best. And so he answered honestly. He said to Rickover, no, I didn't always do my best. And Rickover simply looked at him and said, why not? And then ended the interview. And this question haunted Jimmy Carter for the rest of his life. Not just what he left on the table while he was here, but that was the test, that was the question he asked him as he went through his illustrious and fascinating career, from a governorship to the president to being arguably the greatest ex-president there ever was. And now, towards the end of his life, he's still doing good. He's still inspiring people. Up until a couple years ago, he was still building houses for Habitat for Humanity and still teaching Sunday school. The question of, am I always doing my best, was the standard he tried to live his life by. And it's one that we could do a lot worse than, right? Am I doing my best, right? He strove all his life to make Rickover proud, to be able to answer in the affirmative, yes, I am doing my best. Yes, I'm leaving it all out on the table, in the jersey, on the page, right? I'm as disciplined as I could be. We do our best, right? We rule ourselves rightly. We persist and we resist. We let the virtues guide us. We let honor and courage and commitment guide us, the values of the United States Navy. And if we do that, right, then discipline is destiny and we'll end up where we want to go, which is greatness and goodness. Thank you very much. Do you want to keep your Stoicism journey going? Well, that's the journey that I'm on. Every single day at this computer, I write one Stoic-inspired email that I give away totally for free to people all over the world. There's no spam. You can unsubscribe at any time, and you can sign up at dailystoic.com/email.